City of Tulsa. When I say City of Tulsa, I mean the municipal government, not the town or the people. Their job, as you will see, was to make sure the search for buried victims of the Tulsa Race Massacre is done the right way. And as you may have sensed since I'm here, it has not been done the right way. A word about the Tulsa Race Massacre. It occurred on June 1, 1921, but it has largely been forgotten by history. I call the phenomenon the Great Forgetting, and in my talk tonight, I will show you the exact moment where the Great Forgetting began. The forgetting was almost absolute. Two of the gentlemen who you will hear in the documentary grew up in Greenwood. Greenwood is the name of the community of Tulsa Black citizens that was destroyed in a matter of 6 hours during the race massacre. They grew up in Greenwood in the 1990s, and they themselves had never heard of the massacre until they went to college. And when their professors told them about it, their first reaction was that it could not be true that their professors were lying. But their professors were not lying. And now those two gentlemen are at the forefront in the search for truth and justice. A word about the race massacre. If you pick up a history book today or even the current articles, they will always start with the notion that Greenwood was destroyed by an angry white mob. This is misleading. It was not a mob. It was an army, and it was organized by the men who then controlled the Tulsa city government, and especially the police department. The Tulsa Race Massacre is Tulsa city government's scarlet letter. Basically what happened, to summarize it in a very short period of time, is that on May 31, 1921, a newspaper article appeared in the afternoon newspaper. It reported that a black teenager named Diamond Dick Rowland, that was not his real name, but you can imagine how the name Diamond Dick may have set off people. It was alleged that he had assaulted a young 17-year-old white elevator operator in downtown Tulsa. She was said to be an orphan. The paper reported that he had scratched her face, torn her clothes, and then ran away when a nearby clerk showed up to witness the scene. He was arrested. He was put in the Tulsa County Jail. Almost all of that was false. It was fake news, which I have shown was given to the newspaper by the Tulsa Police Department. The Tulsa Police Department actually wanted to see Diamond Dick Rowland lynched. As preposterous as that sounds, 9 months earlier, a white teenager was easily removed from the Tulsa County Jail and lynched in a spectacular show right outside of town, which was watched by 2,000 people. The central culprits of that lynching was again the Tulsa Police Department. They did not prevent him from being taken from the jail, but they showed up at the lynch site to manage the crowd and control the traffic. After that one was over, the Tulsa police chief, who would still be in power during the race massacre, gave a quote to the local papers saying it was the best thing that could happen to Tulsa because it would send a message to the crooks. 9 months later, another crowd knew were together outside the Tulsa County Courthouse expecting another big show. To their surprise, a group of armed Negroes showed up, as the papers called it, intent on preventing a lynching. They had plenty of reason to suspect that a lynching would in fact occur. You can imagine how the presence of armed blacks showing up in downtown white Tulsa triggered people. Later that evening, Shortly after 10 p.m., gunshots broke out in downtown Tulsa and all hell broke loose. There was a melee. The blacks retreated to Greenwood, which was on the other side of the railroad tracks, and there they held at bay what was then an angry mob. Between the outbreak of shooting and dawn the next morning, the Tulsa Police Department and city government converted the mob into an army. The police commissioner deputized over 400 white citizens. The police chief, testifying under oath in his later deposition, bragged that the police had armed 250 of them. In addition, the Tulsa contingent of the State National Guard was tendered into the control of the Tulsa Police Department. The leader of the Tulsa contingent, a man named Rooney, had during the war been the leader of a group called the Home Guard. It was a professionally trained and equipped paramilitary unit that was designed to replace the State Guard, which had been nationalized and sent to the European bloodbath. Members of the Home Guard put their uniforms back on and showed up in downtown Tulsa. Numerous witnesses have pointed out and contended that those Home Guard members played a malevolent role in what soon unfolded. Soldiers from World War I responded to the crises by putting on their uniforms and showing up in downtown Tulsa and standing in formation. The leader of the State Guard took them in hand and conducted a military parade through downtown Tulsa to calm white feelings. At dawn the next morning, a whistle blew. It was a whistle located at the local power plant. It had been set up in 1920 to serve as a riot signal. If the riot signal blew, citizens were supposed to grab their guns and send them downtown Tulsa, converting it to a quote whistling arsenal. At the exact moment the whistle blew, 6 airplanes invaded Greenwood. These airplanes and their pilots terrified the citizens of Greenwood, helping to cause a stampede. They reported on the location of black resistance within Greenwood, and there was a lot of it. It was a military-style World War I battle, the Battle of Greenwood. They dropped military intelligence reports to the police station, and they may have also engaged in the firebombing of Greenwood, which explains why the entire place was leveled to the ground in barely 6 hours. These were not ordinary flyboys. They were deputized members of the police department and had been set up a year earlier as the air police. Let me play a small portion, if I can, of the documentary Oaklawn. Not the best. Over 85 years of and a city fears liability for the crime that I just they don't want to know. They don't want to get justice because they know too justice has to be fun.
There was clearly an intent to hide the massacre. I think for 2 different reasons. For the white community, it was shame, and we don't ever want to have to pay for what happened. Because as we know, officials, public officials, elected officials were complicit in that massacre. So that's one side of it. But for the black community, I think the black community didn't want to talk about it out of fear. I think to a large degree they were afraid that it would have to be.
we're not just talking about remains, we're talking about again somebody's mother, somebody's father. Children, we're talking about the infants that were murdered that day, remains discarded, the charred remains. When you always have that, and you don't see a city trying to make an effort to repair, right, or to rebuild, then those scars are there. When people say, let time heals all things, no, there is no healing if there's not been a concerted effort to really do right by folks. And what happens is, every time you go through the Greenwood area, for me, I feel it. Certainly every time you go past the cemetery, you feel it, because we were out here 20 years ago. There is a psychological scarring, and there are tears, quite frankly, that come out of nowhere. When you think you can talk about it, and then you find the tears coming, it's not because it's like you're super sensitive, but there's a deep pain within that has not been addressed. It is the same that happened 100 years ago. The same kind of, even then they talk about, oh, we're gonna make reparations are due, we're gonna make good, and that never happened.
That lady is State Representative Regina Goodwin. I want to pick up where she ended about the fake plan to repair the damage, because it explains why. My first essay critical of the 1921 Graves investigation is titled An Echo of History. On the afternoon of June 1st, the elite citizens of Tulsa had a major public relations operation. Problem. It was a prideful town. Tulsa had came from pretty much nothing 15 years earlier to a place with magnificent skyscrapers, luxurious residential areas. They called it the Magic City. Now, however, in the course of a few hours, the Magic City had become the home to terror. During the recent World War, propaganda had emphasized the terror of the Germans. They called them the Huns. And now Tulsa were themselves the Huns. In response to this, elite businessmen in the city of Tulsa came up with a brilliant public relations scheme. The scheme was centered here. This is City Hall. But the government only controlled the bottom 3 steps. And at that moment, the city government was at eclipse. The state guard had arrived, imposed martial law, and the mayor, the police commissioner, and even the police chief were laying very low because they could not be certain, they were all Republicans, they could not be certain that the Democratic governor with whom they were already at loggerheads might not cause the cuffs to be slapped on them. So, in tag team fashion, the pinnacle of power in Tulsa went to the 4th floor, which was the home of the Tulsa Chamber of Commerce. The president of the Tulsa Chamber was Major Alvin Niles. He was president of the bank and one of the founders of the American Legion. His close ally, the managing director of the Chamber of Commerce, was a man named Colonel Clarence Douglas. He was a brilliant advertising man. He's now in the Oklahoma Hall of Fame. They came up with a plan to rebuild the homes of Greenwood. The next morning, Thursday, they had a meeting at City Hall involving 50 of the elite, wealthiest businessmen in town. And they said all the right things. They said the city and the county were responsible for the damage and were obliged to foot the bill. They demanded that the insurance companies pay the claims of the people from Greenwood. They announced a plan to rebuild the homes of Greenwood. And that afternoon, they also appointed a 7-man Bureau of Public Welfare who basically took over the running of the city. These were bankers and other big shots. Along the way, these gentlemen would be called the men who do things. That afternoon, Major Niles caused to be published in the Tulsa Afternoon newspaper this article. It was distributed to the United Press and went nationwide. He claimed that Tulsa had never suffered such a grievous wound to its pride. He announced a plan of reparations. This was the first use of the word reparations in connection with what was then called the race riot. He promised that Tulsa could easily raise the money. It had raised over $33 million during the war effort. Those guys knew how to raise money. That was on Thursday. That was the first day of national news coverage. This is the New York Times from that Thursday. The race riot, as it was called, stayed on the front page above the fold of the nation's newspapers for 3 days. At the end of day one, it was like a cliffhanger movie. People's attention had been drawn. What was going to happen next? So the big day of news coverage was Friday. And instead of seeing pictures of the damage or reading about the harm, the American public were treated to headlines like this. The Daily Oklahoma, Tulsa will rebuild the homes of Negroes. The Lawton News, Tulsa to rebuild the burned area. Now, the reparations plan was very limited. It was limited to giving money or rebuilding for Blacks who owned and occupied their own home. Renters, businessmen, absentee landlords were out of luck. But you see how the news quickly converted that into rebuilding the entire burned area. The Muskogee Daily Phoenix, atonement for the tragedy. The Wichita Daily Eagle, it's one of the only newspapers that actually had photographs of the damage. Tulsa citizens to rebuild the raised Negro district. The Springfield Republican, Tulsa businessmen will rebuild. The Austin American, front page, Tulsa to rebuild houses burned in Negro district. The Houston Post, Tulsa businessmen to rebuild Negro district. The Pittsburgh Daily Post, they actually called it a reparations commission. That's the men who do things. This was the second and third time the word reparations was used in connection with the race riot, and the fourth time would not occur till decades later. See where this is going. Front page of the Chicago Tribune, a $500,000 building fund will be raised. Front page above the fold, hard right corner of the New York Times, Tulsa in remorse to rebuild homes. The New York Tribune reported that this was to be done partially as an atonement and partially as an example to other cities. The Philadelphia Inquirer reported that the men who do things had envisioned no problem in raising the money. In fact, the Bureau of Public Welfare, the men who do things, reported to them that 1,000 Tulsa businessmen had already signed up. The money was as good as in the bank. The Baltimore Sun, H.L. Lincoln's newspaper, reported that reports were flowing in to the Bureau of Public Welfare from all over the country offering money to rebuild. That was Friday. As those headlines were hitting the news, the men who do things reached stage 2 of their plan. This is from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. It was issued to the Associated Press by the Bureau of Public Welfare, and it told them that outsiders' money was no good. All the money would be raised in Tulsa. It concluded, and this is, by the way, the article that refers to the men who do things, that we respectfully ask that no campaign funds be given. Tulsa feels equal to the task of its own restitution. You see how heroic this is. Heroic men doing heroic things. As soon as Tulsa's pride had been healed by these headlines, a rebuilding plan vanished without a trace. This is their effort to raise money. Tulsa must restore it, and you see most of the space was taken up by the men who do things. This is how much space it took up on the June 4 issue of the Tulsa World, the largest newspaper in town. I picked June 4 because it is the only day that that tiny ad appeared anywhere in the pages of the Tulsa World. One day. To help things along, locally, the Bureau of Public Welfare asks that nobody give anything of value directly to the Negroes. Get to see that yet? So there was no effort to raise the money. By June the 7th, the Bureau issued a report. They had originally claimed that the city and county were responsible. They withdrew that. They instead said, we're going to let the law decide who is responsible, and the law is still working. They ended up raising barely $12,000. They gave the money to the Red Cross to offset $75,000 in cost to house and maintain the thousands of refugees. Most of those people had been rounded up by the civil authorities, and a great number of them had been marched off, frog marched to the holding pens with their hands held high. The innocent people, and that included little old ladies who couldn't have harmed a fly. In mid-June, this article appeared in the Tulsa Daily World. Before the massacre, there was a rift between the Chamber of Commerce and the City Hall because the street department wanted the offices used by the Chamber of Commerce, which was there rent-free. Well, wounds heal very easily in white Tulsa back then, and you see that a love feast resulted. Chamber of Commerce got to keep their office. Everybody threw arms around each other, and peace was restored on the south side of the tracks. At the same time, Benito Mussolini, the founder of the first fascist political party, was defining fascism as a marriage between state power and corporations' power, big business and big government. I submit to you that a love feast between the Chamber of Commerce and City Hall qualifies as a marriage between fascists. While all that was going on the north side of the tracks, people were living in tents and lean-tos. There aren't many pictures of those because the police commissioner forbade taking photographs. That month of June, 13.5 inches of rain fell on Tulsa. It was the 4th highest monthly rain total of any month in Tulsa's history, dating from 1888 to the present time. Fast forward to now. Gradually, people became aware of the race massacre. In 1999 and 1920, the state legislature established the Race Riot Commission. They made a report, and one of the things they did was to start searching for victims. There were lots of contemporary reports. The reports that bodies were stacked like cordwood, that city trucks were hauling them out of town, that they were loaded on railroad cars, that they were dumped in open pit mines, that they were dumped in the river, or they were incinerated. Among those reports was a suggestion that many of the victims had been buried in Oaklawn. No excavations were started then, and it was pretty much forgotten about until 2018. What focused everybody's attention then was the knowledge that 2021 would bring the centennial of the race massacre to everybody's attention, and it did. NBA stars paid for documentaries. The TV shows carried stories. There were fictionalized versions like The Watchmen. Everybody's attention was coming back. Just then, the current mayor, G.T. Bynum, in 2018, announced a 1921 Graves investigation to search for buried victims. In June of 2019, the first meeting of the Graves Investigation Public Oversight Committee occurred. It was made up of descendants of race massacre victims and other influential people, members of Tulsa's African American Society. As with the men who do things, they said all the right things. Bynum, in his first report, declared that we will have folks from outside the government who would oversee the process. He said that the Oversight Committee was responsible for holding the city accountable and for making sure things were done in the right way. He said, it doesn't matter if you were murdered 2 weeks ago or 98 years ago, no family in this community should have to have as part of their family story an awful event happened and their family members disappeared and they never knew what happened. That's not acceptable, and that's why we're treating this as a homicide investigation. The investigation quickly hooked up with the University of Oklahoma, which has an archaeological survey program, and they appoint state archaeologists. So far as I know, the University of Oklahoma is providing their services gratis. There were tests, underground radar tests in Oklahoma. In mid-2020, there was a test excavation in an area called Sexton, S-E-X-T-O-N, and it was a dry hole. They did not stop. In late 2021, there was an excavation in an area adjacent to an area called the Colored Potter's Field in southwest section of Oaklawn. And there they struck pay dirt. They found an actual mass grave. They identified it as a mass grave. In the first months of 2021, they prepared and got the approval of the Oversight Committee to do a full-scale excavation of this area. The excavation was exquisitely timed for maximum public relations effect. The first shovel bit the dirt on June 1, 2021, the exact centennial of the massacre. Tulsa looked great. Mayor Bynum looked great. If you go today to the city's website, you will see one of his promises: a collective and transparent process, healing and justice, truth and honesty. All of those promises have fallen by the wayside. This is the public benefit that he's received. This is a headline from the Washington Post. A white Republican mayor seeks the truth about Tulsa's race massacre a century ago. They hired professional archaeologists from Florida, 8 of them to come in. They started work on June 7th. They were under contract for 6 to 8 weeks. In a press conference from the mayor, he promised that the excavation would take the majority of the summer.
With test excavations, and I think for all of us who were here last summer in this very room, facing a really frustrating process to start those test excavations, realizing what we thought was an anomaly was in fact construction fill from an old creek bed. And yet, that led to us doing yet the next round of test excavations later in the year, which led us to this mass grave, which we know is a mass grave in a space that we have no history for anything being there at all, no records for anything being there at all, being located right next to the only known marked graves in this cemetery from the race massacre. And so we begin this exhumation process as the next logical step.
For the next 3 weeks, everything looked great. They found 34 graves in this section. They exhumed 20 of them. The remains were solemnly carried by members of the Public Oversight Committee to an on-site lab for forensic study. For once, everybody, black and white, were working shoulder to shoulder. On June 22nd, this is the excavation area. On June 22nd, this is Dr. Carrie Steckelbeck. She is the Oklahoma chief archaeologist. She provides the video reports periodically about what was going on. And on June 22nd, everything was a go. They were taking out bodies. She predicted that they would continue to work into different adjacent areas in the coming weeks, plural. And then it all ended. A bullet that stopped the dig. On June 23, they found the gold standard of what they hoped to find, a trauma victim, especially a gunshot victim. They didn't have to have lab studies. They found this bullet right there underneath the remains labeled OU number 18. Those remains had also been shot right between the eyes. This seemed to be what they were looking for. In 24 hours, it was all over. The dig was stopped. The Public Oversight Committee was not consulted in advance. They'd not been told why it was stopped. They haven't been told who ordered the stoppage, but it was stopped. The professional archaeologists were sent home 3 weeks into a projected 6 and 8 week dig. Finally, so time passed. The Oversight Committee wanted to have a meeting. They finally got one on July 27, 2021. It was different than all the other meetings. All the other meetings were open to the public. They were recorded. They were posted in multiple places on the city's website. This meeting was private. This meeting, while it was recorded, has never been posted on a public forum. As it turns out, I have the link, and you do too now, on the back page of that handout that I've given you. Don't tell anybody where you got it. During this meeting, the Oversight Committee was floored to discover, you remember the promise was of a homicide investigation, never occurred. Early on in 2021, the Oversight Committee was assured that we're not just looking for people who there is some actual bureaucratic record. They had records for 18 adult male blacks buried in pine boxes without hands. They were looking for all potential victims of the race massacre, and it was known that women and children were victims as well. That was out the window. Now, they were only focused on the 18 males, putting the city in the preposterous position of treating women and children victims as second-class citizens, even in death. The chair of the committee, a man named Kevin Ross, complained he had been appointed by the mayor, complained that he could never get answers to information from the city. The mayor appointed him and then treated him as unworthy of answers. When they got to the question of who stopped the dig, Mayor Bynum wasn't there. He allowed his underlings and the technical staff to try to answer the question, and they promptly threw each other under the bus. The deputy chief of staff said, well, the team on the ground did it. The team on the ground was having nothing to do with that. The chief forensic anthropologist said she didn't know who ordered the dig. Think about that. She was there every day. She was one of the two key team members of the ground, and even she doesn't know why it was shut down. The real reason that the city called that meeting was because they wanted to take the then 20 remains and left 14 of them in the ground, put them back in the same hole, cover them up, take the labs off premises, and be done with it. That's pretty much exactly what happened. When the city, there was a real problem with reburying these bodies in the same pit. The area where they dug them up had been a former swamp and garbage dump. Funny how that works out, since that was part of the Colored Parks field. So nobody wanted, on the technical team, really wanted them reburied there. At the end of the meeting, the committee voted unanimously to delay the reburial, which was planned for 3 days later on Friday, July 13th. Dr. Phoebe Stubblefield, the forensic anthropologist, joined the vote and urged the vote to be taken. Even Dr. Carrie Stackelback, the state archaeologist who's closely aligned with the mayor, thought that reburying them in a different place, such as Sexton, which was high above the water line, was a good idea. Everybody was still united. The mayor's deputy chief of staff promised answers, quote, immediately tomorrow, and then we would plan to meet to plan next steps. The next meeting was 6 months later. The answers have never arrived. Instead, on Friday, July 30th, 2021, we had the very epitome of divide and conquer. A largely white group held a brief prayer. These are the airtight containers containing the remains. During the earlier private briefing, Regina Goodwin, who you saw, had warned everybody that if you proceed with this precipitous step, you are going to convince Black Tulsans that a cover-up is going on. And sure enough, when people got wind of it, some of them showed up and they were madder than hornets. But it was not simply white versus black that was divided against each other. It was black versus black. Regina, during the meeting, said, I want to know who's going to face the microphones when this thing goes down. And it was like she sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Well, there's the answer. One of those women, Phoebe Stubblefield, who opposed the reburial. The other one is Brenda Alford, former chairman of the Oversight Committee, who argued eloquently for a delay, and that's who had to face the music. Bynum was nowhere to be found. They then covered up the bodies, they smoothed the ground over. In September, they removed the labs, and you couldn't tell anything had happened in Oaklawn were it not for the two PR advertising signs that they put up on the iron gates. 6 months passed. They finally had a March meeting. There was a public access link available for it, but it wasn't given to the public. It was another private meeting that has never been posted to the public. The technical team concluded that we don't know if any of these are massacre victims, but we should start digging again, which is what they were equipped to do 6 months earlier. And yet, nothing happened. The summer 2022 passed. Finally, 16 months later, in late October, out of the blue, the city announced that we're going to start the Oaklawn digging. Coincidentally, that was on the eve of the premiere of the documentary Oaklawn, Tulsa. They found 32 more bodies. They've only exhumed 8. And one of those was another bullet wound victim. And the announcement of the bullet discovery occurred on the exact date that Oaklawn premiered in Tulsa. To put this 16-month delay in perspective, meet the 3 surviving members, massacre victims. Uncle Red, 102. Mother Randall, 108. Viola Fletcher, they all appeared before Congress. She's 108. And while that 16-month delay was going on, the clock was ticking on their lives. In 2022, there were 4 meetings of the Public Oversight Committee. With one exception, they were all private. No meetings have been posted. I assumed that the meetings were being recorded, just hidden. On Pollyanna was I. We just learned that the city didn't even hit the record button. Those meetings have been pre-erased from the public, the media, and history forever. When the city was inquired about from this by the Oklahoma Eagle newspaper, the city said, well, the news media and the committee could have recorded it if they wished. Were people required to read the city's mind to know that the city had dropped its reporting policy? There was no recording given. There was no warning given. Ironically, the Oklahoma Eagle had not received notices of those meetings, even though it had asked. And if there was one newspaper in the entire world that should have gotten news of that, it was the Eagle. It's a 101-year-old newspaper and founded and established in Greenwood and founded with the salvaged printing press of the Massacre destroyed Tulsa Star newspaper. I have come to believe, so the net effect of this is that the city has minimized the number of people who can watch, frustrated national interest, and isolated and gagged the Public Oversight Committee. As I conclude, I have come to believe that no matter how powerful and lie, you all know how powerful lies can be, the truth is 1,000 times more powerful. Allow me to demonstrate. The last thing that happened in the oversight in the Graves investigation, November 18, 2022, when Bynum resurfaced for a public press conference. That was his photo opportunity. At the end of that meeting, an enterprising reporter raised her hand. She had actually talked to members of the Oversight Committee who were wanting a public meeting. All of these other meetings were virtual, where people were isolated, fragmented, and controllable. G.T. Bynum will never allow a public meeting. He cannot do so because to do so will bring out the truth. He was ready to go for the question. Listen now to his polished miscarriage of the truth.
This question has come up repeatedly. The challenge for us, as you heard today, is that our experts who are leading this investigation are based all around the United States. So to make them accessible to both the folks on the Public Oversight Committee, but also anybody else that wants to participate in the meeting. And the reality is, at this point, there's an international interest in this investigation. We've been doing those meetings virtually to maximize the number of people that can watch them and be able to get the information from them, and to allow members of the Public Oversight Committee to ask any questions of the experts that they want and have them available for those. So that is our intent, to just continue that approach moving forward.
Contrast that to this in conclusion. It's a segment from the documentary by Greg Robinson, who is a member of the Oversight Committee.
To me, you have to be overly communicative. You have to be overly understanding. You have to take extra pains to be of extra care because we're doing this process to move forward as a city. Everyone has a little piece of it. And so when you don't give it 100%, when people have given that faith in you, thinking that that's what you're doing, you destroy what has frankly taken 100 years to build up to this point. And that's the damaging part of this. If you're gonna start something like this, then you've got to be 100% committed to it, and you've got to do it right. And there can't be any space for thinking that maybe you're just doing it to make yourself look good. Because that's the exact same pattern that has happened since the massacre of 1921. Something occurs, the city covers it up. Something bad occurs, and the city covers it up over and over and over again. So yes, I'm frustrated as a community member. Yes, I'm frustrated as an oversight committee member. But I want people to understand why I'm frustrated. I'm not just mad for no reason. I'm mad because I know that it's going to take all of us to get through this as a city. And if we don't do it right, we're damaging all of us. We ought to be as transparent as possible. We ought to try to dig up every mass grave or potential mass grave that's out there. We ought to be upfront about that, right? Because that's the only way to show people that we're really trying to get at the truth.
I rest my case. Thank you for listening.
You did a great job of being on time too. So we have time for questions. And oh, here we go. Go ahead. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mike. First of all, I want to say thank you for bringing up this very timely presentation, thorough presentation. This touched home for me personally. I was one of the students of the attorney. I was a mentee of Charles Ogletree, who was one of the civil rights attorneys who was charged with addressing this case. When I was in law school in 2006, we escorted the original Tulsa racist survivors to Washington as they were trying to file a writ in the Supreme Court on this case. There has been so much of an attention and a chasing of the media attention, and I appreciate your presentation revealing the politics that people have pushed forward instead of equitable outcomes that these survivors deserve. So when we have the Viola Fletchers of the world that are still living, it's important that people in this room and in other spaces understand what the struggle really is about, and then make sure that we all commit to getting them restorative justice as well. Thank you so much.
Just a short comment. My name is Alan Livingston. I'm 80 years old. I'm from Tulsa. I was born and raised in Tulsa. My grand.
It's on the top. You gotta speak at the top.
Okay, I'm speaking into the top now. Okay. My name is Alan Livingston. I was born and raised in Tulsa. I'm 80 years old. My grandfather moved to Tulsa in 1908, 1 year after statehood. My grandfather told me, or my grandfather died 1 year before I was born. But I was told by my parents relating to the Tulsa race riot that during the time of the riot, my grandfather sheltered 5 families in their house for several weeks to keep them out of the problems that happened. One of the people was working with my family for 65 years. I heard many stories about the race massacre firsthand from her friends. Growing up, I was very much exposed to this situation. In the 1960s, I was a high school editor on my newspaper, and I wrote a short article on the Tulsa race program at that time. I don't think anybody else hardly knew about it. I was exposed to it quite openly. Both my parents, unfortunately, have passed away, of course, but I've lived with this all my life. My father had another run-in with the Klan in the 1920s, but that's another story. But I'm still very much considered myself a Tulsan, and this was a real blow on the community. But there were people in Tulsa that at that time sheltered other families and were very upset about what had happened and tried to make amends over the years. That's all I can say.
I'll ask a question. They handed me the mic real quickly. The neighborhood was the wealthiest African-American neighborhood in America at the time. And so my question is, was the massacre, at least partially, a populist uprising against wealth, in addition to being a racist uprising against a particular ethnic.
And so Judge Fine actually had a good one, and we heard it twice. As you answer that question, kind of the final, what's the next step and what's the end game? What's going on here? Why are they doing it other than just keep covering it up?
I think like most questions in life, it's a multiple choice question and there's a lot of choices and the correct answer tends to be some of all of the above. What remains, the last scheduled quarterly meeting wasn't even conducted. We will wait till the team on the ground studies the 8 bodies. They will have a report. We will try to have that will be publicized. Whether it's public, recorded, I don't know. I cannot predict the future, but I can tell you that the members of the oversight committee that I have worked with and I myself are not going to give up.
Urge you to go to this website. It's phenomenal. It's phenomenal. It will give you a tour, it will give you information, and it's been put together really as a result of tremendous writing that's appeared in local magazines. This is first class, and it includes how the truth was butchered, along with the story of the original supposed elevator. And just to read Randall's endnotes of visit joy. And I'm sorry to sound so nerdy about something so.
I've heard you say before how enjoyable endnotes are.
There is a QR link. Oaklawn is online. Watching this afternoon. Please do so. It's on Patreon, and it will be well worth your time. An hour and 15 minutes.
Well, actually, I'll do one better than that. We've already confirmed there's an update. You know, not just what happened back then, but what's continuing to happen. The documentary will be available. We've already got local folks likely to come down to speak to us at the panel. The day before our already confirmed June 22nd Zaza afternoon event. That night, we're going to have a special showing with local members of the Tulsa community that are actively involved in this fight. So you can kind of mark that on your calendar. June 21st, you're going to see these folks in person along with the documentary. Thank you all very much. We'll see you next month.
Yeah.